This grain has been nicknamed the gold of the Andes. Most of it comes from Peru, where around 100,000 tons are produced every year. The popularity of quinoa exploded over the past decade, transforming the fortunes of farmers who have been harvesting it for generations.
Y quizás muchas familias también han hecho estudiar a sus hijos en una universidad, ¿no? Una universidad o un tecnológico, gracias a que este cultivo tiene un valor.
Unfortunately, those good years may be coming to an end. Other countries have increased quinoa production, driving down prices, and shifting weather patterns are threatening yields. But quinoa is a superfood with more than 3,000 varieties, even though you'll only find a handful of them at the supermarket. So can the people who brought their staple food to the world help it adapt to an uncertain future? People across the Andes have been eating quinoa way before it hit the shelves at gourmet markets.
Nuestros abuelos, bisabuelos, siempre nos han enseñado a que este alimento deben comerlo primero, ¿no? Porque es lo que les va a ayudar más adelante para que cuando seamos abuelos pues no estemos también enfermándonos de la salud, de todas esas cosas, ¿no?
For centuries, Peruvians have ground the grain to make flour and ferment chicha, a popular drink. Quinoa was sacred to the Inca, who called it the mother grain. That's because it grew well under harsh conditions and flourished in areas where other crops struggled. The grain has adapted as weather patterns have changed in recent years, but growing it is still a struggle.
Nos ha empezado un poco a rotar el tiempo de cosecha, ¿no? El tiempo de siembra ya no es en el mismo tiempo, ¿no?
Ignacio is one of around 68,000 quinoa producers in Peru. He's been out in the fields with his family since he was just 10 years old.
Yo era menor de edad todavía, no podía trabajar así como al nivel que trabajo ahora, ¿no? Y tampoco poco a poco iba entendiendo, ¿no? Cómo se hacía el sembrío, todo, ¿no?
The season to plant quinoa starts at the end of the summer. Workers gather early in the morning, and they pass around handfuls of coca leaves. Then they call to Pachamama, or Mother Earth, to help them get the job done quickly. Ignacio says the plant acts as a mild stimulant that gives them strength. Ignacio and his family sow the seeds after the soil has been harrowed and fertilized. About 7 months later, they harvest the crop by hand.
Y se pone a secar al sol. Como está lloviendo ahorita, el grano está húmedo. Y cuando está húmedo, si lo colocamos, tiende a honguearse.
Then they cut the branches and remove the edible parts of the grain.
El trabajo de la cosecha de la quinoa es cansado, sí, es cansado.
They shake the grain to remove any leftover dirt, and then transfer the quinoa to a small warehouse.
Gracias al apoyo que tengo de mis hermanos, de mis padres, entre todos hemos ido trabajando un poco más.
Listo para la planta.
About a decade ago, Ignacio and his family would have traveled across the country to sell their quinoa.
Nosotros teníamos que llevarlo a otro lugar, ¿no? Al mercado local, llevar quizás hasta Juliaca, hasta Puno, ¿no? Para poder venderlo. Cosa que hacía un trabajo de más, ¿no?
But that's now the job of Copain Cabana, a cooperative that represents more than 600 farmers in southern Peru.
De ahí fue la iniciativa para poder nosotros como productores unirnos, ¿no? Hacer un equipo, en formar una alianza con unos productores de otras zonas también.
Representatives from cooperatives like Eusebio visit the farms to inspect the grains. The cooperatives pay farmers like Ignacio about $1.50 per kilo.
Le damos asistencia técnica, le facilitamos con maquinaria, le facilitamos con insumos, ¿no? Para que tengan. Sin embargo, no les regalamos, sino también es al costo del productor.
About 1,200 tons of quinoa are processed every year at the cooperative's facilities. Once the quinoa reaches their warehouse, workers thoroughly wash it twice to remove a bitter chemical called saponin.
Porque si no se hace un buen lavado, entonces tiene cierto amargor la quinoa.
They split the quinoa into categories, remove any impurities, and then package it. It'll make its way overseas. The cooperative says it exports to the US, the European Union, and Japan. In the US, the product has become increasingly popular. America imports about a third of all the world's quinoa. But it wasn't always this way. Quinoa used to be mostly unknown outside of the Andes.
El precio, y era muy barato. La gente no quería quinoa.
But it all began to change in 2009, when the Peruvian government started establishing free trade agreements. It became easier for companies to export to the US and beyond. Over the next few years, commerce between Peru and the US reportedly boomed. Word spread about the nutritious superfood that was gluten-free and high in protein.
This was when stuff like the keto diet were taking off, and there was this conventional wisdom that, hey, look, among all of those grains that you can be eating, quinoa probably packs the strongest punch in terms of protein.
The United Nations even declared 2013 the International Year of Quinoa to celebrate the ancestral practices of the Andean people.
Basically, shining a big, bright spotlight on quinoa as something that people should consume for their health, and that really led to the whole thing.
The average price of quinoa in Peru almost doubled between 2012 and 2014. And it wasn't just producers who benefited. The rise in quinoa sales helped locals who didn't even work with the crop.
There was probably some kind of trickle-down effect in the economy where the quinoa price rise led to the people who were selling it being significantly better off and spending some of those funds on the economy.
In 2011, almost 80% of the country's quinoa was produced in the region of Puno. But farmers in other parts of the country tried to cash in too. Some reportedly relied on chemical fertilizers to cultivate the grain. In 2014, Peru set a record for quinoa production. But trouble lay ahead for Peruvian farmers. For centuries, the grain had mostly been harvested in the Andes because it thrives in high altitudes. But quinoa farmers started popping up in other parts of the world.
Hemos visto que en los últimos años se ha ido produciendo bastante quinoa en todos los lugares, no simplemente acá en Perú.
I think globalization is a double-edged sword in a case like this. These households can benefit from the global demand for that product, but it also means that it has really pushed other regions of the globe to experiment with growing quinoa themselves.
The market was flooded with quinoa. That caused prices to plunge by the end of 2015. Farmers in Peru reportedly began to struggle, and some had to sell livestock to survive. Others held on to their quinoa, hoping that prices would rise again. But by 2020, the price of quinoa in Peru had dropped to about half of its 2014 high. Meanwhile, farmers in Peru are producing more quinoa than ever. But the types sold in supermarkets represent just a fraction of the 3,000 varieties that can be harvested here.
Siempre es bueno sembrar la quinoa, no simplemente en un color nomás, ¿no? Sino en los tres colores, en roja, en negra y en quinoa blanca también, ¿no? Porque al final lo que vendemos pues son los tres colores.
Farmers would traditionally cultivate different types of quinoa to make sure that at least some thrived if weather conditions were harsh. But some have abandoned this practice to focus on the most lucrative strains. And experts worry this may mean losing many varieties of the ancient crop.
Sí sería malo perder esta gran variabilidad que tenemos, puesto que sabemos que algunas tienen algunos compuestos que no todas presentan.
That's why many are brought here, to the National Institute of Agricultural Innovation.
Los agricultores normalmente mantienen la semilla porque el cultivo de quinoa es un cultivo milenario. Entonces ellos han mantenido las semillas, nosotros como INIA hemos colectado esa semilla y ahora la mantenemos almacenada en los bancos. Acá en el Perú más o menos como banco almacenamos cerca de 17 variedades.
Some of those less common strains could have uses beyond food.
Hemos visto que ese contenido esas saponinas pueden ser de utilidad para la industria, bien sea para el desarrollo de fármacos o para la industria de los detergentes. Los agricultores también podrían estar sacando una ganancia produciendo específicamente esta gran diversidad que contenemos.
Ignacio says he would eventually like to sell baked goods, like cookies, made of quinoa. But for now, he has to focus on what sells.